There we go. Welcome, everyone. Tonight we'll hear from Jerry Beyer about his great new book about the shift, as I put it, from a clericalist church, I suppose, university to a capitalist-centered one. We're speaking with Gerald Beyer tonight. Gerald is professor of Christian ethics at Villanova University and associate ethics editor of Horizons, the Journal of the College Theology Society. At Villanova, he teaches undergraduates, master's, and doctoral students. He also taught at St. Joseph's University for 9 years. His publications include Recovering Solidarity, Lessons from Poland's Unfinished Revolution by the University of Notre Dame Press in 2010. And the book we'll talk about tonight, Just Universities, Catholic Social Teaching Confronts Corporatized Higher Education, which Fordham published this year, and which Mary Roach wrote a very favorable review about in Collegium News that some of you may have seen. Beyer co-edited and contributed a chapter to the critical edition of Karol Wojtyła's Katolika Etyka Społeczna. At least I practiced that before, and I may not have gotten it right. In Lublin in Poland in 2018. He's published widely in popular outlets such as the National Catholic Reporter and in academic journals. His article, Labor Unions, Adjuncts, and the Mission and Identity of Catholic Universities, won the 2015 College Theology Society Best Article Published in Theology Award. Beyer is vice president of the Villanova chapter of the American Association of University Professors and vice chair of the Catholic Scholars for Worker Justice. So Jerry, thanks. Thank you for speaking to our Collegium alums. And I'll let you take that over from here. We'll talk for a while, and then I'll moderate some conversation afterwards with our guests.
Thank you, Tom. I'm going to move pretty quickly through this so that we can get to conversation, or at least as quickly as I can. Good evening to everybody. Thanks for taking time out of your busy schedules to be here tonight. I'm happy to be with you. And I want to especially thank Tom in particular for inviting me to speak to the Collegium community. Given my time limit, I'm just going to skim the surface of some of the complex issues that we must contend with if we're to remain faithful to the mission of Catholic colleges and universities. My book presents in much greater detail the arguments that I present to you tonight. I've spent over a decade thinking about and writing about these issues that I discuss. That's not to say that I've reached definitive conclusions about all of them or found a panacea to fix the problems that I see in higher education. I readily admit that my work is conditioned by my own perspective and social location as a Catholic, white, straight, cisgender male who is protected by what I call tenure track privilege, in addition to the unearned advantages that I have due to those other aspects of my identity. In addition, I readily acknowledge that I personally do not face the pressure to keep a Catholic college or university financially solvent, a pressure that inevitably keeps many administrators awake at night. My critiques of Catholic higher education are born of a love and gratitude for the many years I benefited from it. Moreover, I acknowledge that Catholic colleges and universities in the US serve students and society in many laudable ways. However, like James L. Marsh, who actually recently sadly passed away, who spent 3 decades teaching at Catholic universities, and I quote Professor Marsh, "I love these institutions as much or more for what they can be as for what they are," end quote. Given that there are more than 250 Catholic colleges and universities, and that these issues are very complex, I don't contend that I offer here universal definitive accounts of what happens on every campus. Rather, I point to problems that may or may not be universal, but are pervasive enough to warrant concern. And I point to promising practices in attending to these issues where they exist. By virtue of their mission and identity, Catholic colleges and universities are obliged to teach the Catholic social tradition and discuss its vision for a more just, peaceful, and sustainable world. This obligation requires promoting justice both within the institution itself and more broadly in society. For as the 1971 Synod of Bishops stated, quote, "Anyone who ventures to speak to people about justice must first be just in their eyes," end quote. Many Catholic colleges and universities have developed strong efforts to promote justice in the world. However, confronting racism, white privilege, classism, and economic injustices and other inequities within our own hallowed halls, not just out there in American society and the world more broadly, have sometimes not been as successful. and are sometimes even met with resistance. On more than one occasion, students have expressed to me the belief that there's no point in learning Catholic social teaching if they're not seeing it practiced by their own Catholic institution. I've literally had students in my office either in tears or irate about this hypocrisy. Thus, St. John Paul II was right to say that, quote, today more than ever, the church is aware of her social message, that her social message will gain credibility more immediately from the witness of actions than as a result of its internal logic and consistency. Succinctly stated, Catholic universities must build solidarity with the oppressed and promote, quote, justice and liberation from every kind of oppression, those are words of Pope Benedict, both beyond and on their campuses in order to evangelize. Catholic institutions of higher learning have a clear mandate to do this. As the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops has maintained, quote, all the moral principles that govern the just operation of any economic endeavor apply to the church and its agencies and institutions. Indeed, the church should be exemplary, end quote. Thus, the Association of Catholic Colleges and Universities has formally recommended Catholic institutions, quote, continue to strive to incorporate CST into all aspects of their institutional life, end quote. The problems that I consider have great pedagogical import. Our aim at Catholic institutions is not simply to transmit knowledge, but to help shape the minds and hearts of our students so they can transform the world for the better. In other words, we should seek to aid them in the formation of their consciences. If teaching CST is to have this kind of transformative effect on our students, Catholic educators and institutions must move from talk to action. Modeling the ideals of the Catholic social tradition is even more important than teaching them in the classroom. In this connection, the logic of the market should not dominate Catholic higher education. If we demonstrate by our policy decisions and institutional arrangements that our values can be forsaken in the name of efficiency, fiscal responsibility, innovation, market competition, etc., we convey to our students that living out the gospel and Catholic social teaching simply costs too much, thereby affirming the nihilism and relativism already in the air. As the late Jesuit Father Dean Brackley argued, a transformative pedagogy that nurtures the faith and intellect of our students and engenders concern for the common good requires, quote, orthopraxis, including conspicuous respect for the rights of workers and all vulnerable members of the learning community, end quote. The corporatization of higher education hinders Catholic institutions' ability to fulfill their mission, which includes creating an environment imbued with CST's respect for human rights, solidarity, justice, and the common good. The corporatization of the university has infected higher education with hyper-individualistic practices and models. In this paradigm, members of the university community, including entire programs or departments, who are perceived to be weaker, are seen as drags on the system and should be marginalized or even eliminated. The corporatized university also reifies sharply hierarchical structures. These structures denigrate an important feature of the human person according to Catholic thought, namely, her natural inclination to participation in the shaping of those structures that affect her life and those around her most significantly. More concretely, the corporatized university is, as Henry Steck puts it, quote, an institution that is characterized by processes, decisional criteria, expectations, organizational culture, and operating practices that are taken from and have their origins in the modern business corporation, end quote. Corporatized universities are, in Steck's words, quote, characterized by the entry of the university into marketplace relationships and by the use of market strategies in university decision-making, end quote. I advanced the thesis in my book that there's a kind of culture clash in Catholic higher education between Catholic social teaching and the culture and ethos of the corporatized university. Unfortunately, students, faculty, staff, and administrators are harmed as a result. For example, models such as responsibility-centered management, also known as RCM, quote, create powerful incentives to employ much cheaper labor, in other words, adjunct faculty, as the savings enables academic units to generate more revenue from tuition. I'm quoting here two former university administrators, notably. This has created a situation in which some administrators, athletics personnel, and full-time faculty make very handsome salaries, while adjuncts and graduate instructors live in or on the edge of poverty. I demonstrate that the principles of justice and solidarity pertaining to wages deems this situation and the market fundamentalism, a term I borrow from Stan Duncan and others, used to justify it unacceptable. Corporatization of the university skews priorities. Prior to the pandemic, economist of higher education Stephen Schulman contended that, quote, colleges and universities often claim that they are unable to afford certain expenditures when they simply are choosing other expenditures instead. The problem is not their overall financial capacity so much as it is their priorities, end quote. I do not deny that some institutions face real financial exigencies, but we must challenge what Francois Furstenberg called recently an era of, quote, artificial scarcity, in which many are asked to take pay cuts, salary freezes, less in retirement benefits, or even layoffs or elimination of entire programs and departments, only to find that many of the same institutions are not experiencing financial exigency and may even be running surpluses. Much more could be said about corporatization. I'll just add something that echoes the thinking of giants of Catholic higher education, no doubt familiar to many of you, Sister Alice Galen, Father William Beyer, and others. We've still not ensured that decision makers at Catholic institutions are as well versed in Catholic social teaching as they are in expertise from the corporate world and other fields. Following Father Byron, I suggest, among other things, mandatory mission and identity trainings for board members and all high-level administrators, and of course, ideally for all faculty and staff. But I do believe that these trainings should start at the highest levels. And these trainings should be robustly rooted in Catholic social teaching. Before I turn to some particular issues, let me offer a key overarching argument from my book. Too often, Catholic universities tend to highlight their achievements on particular justice issues while overlooking others. For example, many Catholic institutions have made great strides in the area of environmental stewardship, although some have already challenged me on this point since the book has been published. However, some of the same institutions trample on the rights of workers on their campuses. Thus, I asked, if the 100 Catholic university presidents who signed a declaration to support the ecological vision of Pope Francis' Laudato Si in the summer of 2015 would sign a declaration on the rights of all workers on college campuses, a declaration that would reflect Catholic social teaching on the right to unionize and to a living and just wage. What about a solemn pledge to enact the option for the poor in recruiting, admissions, financial aid, and retention policies? Would they sign a document that went beyond platitudes to promote the real inclusion and participation in authority structures of racial minorities, women, and LGBTQ persons on their campuses? These questions are rooted in Catholic social teaching's insistence that we cannot simply pick and choose our favorite justice issues. In fact, the vision of integral ecology elaborated by Pope Francis in Laudato Si holds that, quote, since everything is closely interrelated and today's problems call for a vision capable of taking into account every aspect of the global crises, we must now consider some elements of an integral ecology, which clearly respects human and social dimensions, end quote. Succinctly stated, integral ecology demands that Catholic universities rightfully commit themselves to sustainability and care of the environment, while simultaneously earnestly pursuing what St. John Paul II called a, quote, social ecology of work, one that respects the rights to a living wage and freedom of association. They must also pursue education that empowers the marginalized and a milieu that fosters equity for the historically marginalized. Now, let me say something more about worker justice on campus. Many adjunct faculty, which of course is an objectionable term for these dedicated professors, rank among the working poor, given that the national median pay for a 3-credit course is somewhere around $3,000 at the present. The 2014 House Committee on Education and the Workforce report, called the Just in Time Professor, states that many adjuncts earn from $15,000 to $20,000 annually. Incidentally, I'll add that the pay has gone up slightly since then. But to quote that document from the House Committee, these adjuncts were earning salaries and continue to earn salaries, putting them at, quote, in or on the edge of poverty. Furthermore, other data indicate that 31% of part-time faculty live near or below the federal poverty line. A study from the UC Berkeley Center for Labor Research reports that 25% of all part-time professors receive Medicaid and/or food stamps. Adjunct faculty, as we likely know, do not have health and retirement benefits. They essentially work as temps with no job security. My research has revealed that although there are some promising practices, such as Georgetown's just employment policy, the wages and benefits such as affordable healthcare, an affordable healthcare plan, of adjunct faculty and many other campus workers at Catholic colleges and universities do not reflect Catholic social teaching on the rights of workers. Nationally, part-time faculty and graduate students now comprise about 53% of the academic labor force, with another 17% full-time contingent faculty. As a whole, Catholic institutions employ adjuncts at a similar level, according to IPED's data. And here I'm indebted to a scholar, Jacob Bennett, who has done a dissertation on the employment of adjuncts at Catholic institutions. To add insult to injury, there have been a number of cases of union busting on Catholic campuses. I don't have the time to lay out the arguments here fully, but I have contended in articles and in my book that first, this is a violation of Catholic teaching on the rights of all workers to form unions. Second, unions do not threaten the religious freedom of Catholic colleges and universities, as some institutions have argued. Conversely, union busting threatens the religious freedom and conscious rights of workers. Third, union busting gives rise to scandal, possibly harming the faith formation of our students, who are rightly very sensitive to hypocrisy in church-related institutions. And finally, union busting constitutes what we call in what the tradition of Catholic moral theology is called formal cooperation in evil, which is never permissible and can be mortal sin if undertaken while conscious of Catholic teaching on the right to unionize. As I said, the worker justice problem extends, of course, to other types of low-wage campus workers, many of whom must struggle for decent pay, the right to unionize, access to healthcare, et cetera. In the last several years, we've seen a number of worker justice campaigns on Catholic campuses among staff, often with admirable solidarity from students. Presently, these workers, many of whom are people of color with heightened COVID-19 risk, are risking their health and lives on our campuses, only to be told sometimes that they cannot be tested on campus, nor will they receive hazard pay. Paying adjunct faculty and other campus workers below a living wage while paying some administrator or athletics personnel 30 to 100 times more clearly conflicts with Catholic social teaching. These disparities, which are often justified by appeals to market logic, cannot be justified in light of CST. As St. John the 23rd maintained in Mater et Magistra, quote, disproportionately high wages are unjust, end quote, particularly when many workers are not paid a living wage. That's paragraph number 70 of Mater et Magistra. The Pope also contended, quote, the remuneration of work is not something that can be left to the laws of the marketplace, nor should it be a decision left to the will of the more powerful. It must be determined in accordance with justice and equity, end quote. Now let me turn to recruiting, admissions, retention, and the option for the poor. Catholic social teaching has long championed the right to education of all people, including the poor. In the US context, the Roman Catholic bishops have argued that all of society must, quote, make a much stronger commitment to education for the poor, end quote. Recent trends in American higher education reveal this is not the case at the university level. In fact, many universities have adopted what I call a preferential option for the rich. Some elite colleges and universities have more students from families with income in the top 1% than from the lowest 60% of earners taken as a whole. While meaningful progress on access has occurred at some colleges and universities, higher education is still out of the reach for far too many people in our country. Because Catholic teaching affirms the right to education for the poor, it's important to ask whether Catholic colleges and universities mirror these national trends. In other words, have they exercised solidarity with the marginalized in the preferential option for the poor, two of the key principles of CST in their recruiting, admissions, and retention policies? The obligation to do so is clear, for as John Paul II stated, Catholic universities must, quote, be capable of searching for ways to make university education accessible to all those who are able to benefit from it, especially the poor or members of minority groups who customarily have been deprived of it, end quote. The record in recent times among Catholic colleges and universities is mixed. The Education Trust deems 5 of the wealthiest Catholic colleges and universities, quote, engines of inequality because they, quote, fall in the bottom 5% of institutions for their enrollment of students from working class and low income backgrounds, end quote. I look at this issue in a good bit of detail in the book. This is the case even though the endowments of these 5 schools rank among the top 10 for Catholic institutions of higher learning and are among the largest 175 of any type of higher educational institution. The Opportunity Project data indicates more students hail from the top 1% of household income than the bottom 60% combined at Notre Dame, Georgetown, Boston College, and Villanova. Many elite secular institutions exhibit this phenomenon, but Catholic institutions need to ask whether or not these facts cohere with CST, particularly the preferential option for the poor. Some of the wealthiest Catholic institutions, like St. John's University in New York, appear much more favorably in light of the CST principle, with many more low-income students than members of the economic upper echelon. Other Catholic institutions fall somewhere in between. So as I said, the record is mixed. The lack of economic diversity is not confined to the wealthiest or most selective Catholic institutions. For example, Catholic universities occupy 4 of the 10 lowest rankings in U.S. News and World Report's Economic Diversity Index for the Regional Universities North category. Moreover, very few Catholic institutions rank among the leaders in providing a low net cost education for large numbers of Pell recipients. One of the benchmarks of an institution that is truly dedicated to access for all is being an institution that is low net cost and high Pell. So I'm going to talk about that. For example, only Calumet College of St. Joseph and the University of Holy Cross in Louisiana earned the distinction of high Pell, low net cost in the New America Foundation's most recent report on private institutions. It should be noted, however, that some Catholic institutions are high Pell, but just barely miss the designation of low net cost because they charge a net price slightly above the $10,000 threshold used in the report. So I don't want to criticize institutions that seem to be at least moving in the right direction. So we have to look closely at the data. Many highly selective, high Pell, low cost institutions, secular that is, have substantially larger endowments than most of their Catholic peers. However, the example of Franklin and Marshall College demonstrates that institutions can achieve relatively high Pell percentages and relatively low net cost, even with a modest endowment compared to the 10 wealthiest Catholic institutions. So I have some tables in the book that depict what I'm describing here. Furthermore, a number of smaller, well less endowed Catholic institutions outperform the wealthier institutions using what might be called an option for the poor metric, even though they have fewer resources. As mentioned above, a few Catholic institutions are high Pell, low net cost, with another group of high Pell schools with net costs close to the low net cost threshold. In addition, institutions like Christian Brothers University, LaSalle University, Loyola Marymount University all admit many more low-income students than the wealthiest Catholic institutions. Smaller schools such as Trinity University, Washington, Mount St. Mary's in California, and St. Peter's College in New Jersey, St. Peter's University, have even more low-income students. In other words, in many cases, those with less are doing more, which seems to turn Jesus's injunction, quote, from the one who has been trusted with much, much more will be asked. That's from Luke chapter 12, the NIV, seems to turn Jesus' injunction on its head. Now let me move to racial inclusion, racial justice, inclusion, and the right to participation. I know that I'm moving rather quickly across these complicated issues, but I just wanted to give you a flavor, a sense of the entire book in the short time we have. In 1979, the Catholic Conference of Bishops document Brothers and Sisters to Us called for a, quote, effective affirmative action program in every diocese and religious institution, end quote. Furthermore, the bishops specifically stated that Catholic schools and universities should ensure that their employment policies adhere to CST on, quote, justice for workers and respect for their rights, end quote. In the US, the rate of matriculation of Blacks and Latinos to degree granting post-secondary institutions has increased substantially over the last several decades, growing much faster than whites and diminishing the racial gap, though the same cannot be said for American Indians or Alaskan Natives. However, two researchers from Georgetown University have demonstrated that, quote, the post-secondary system is more and more complicit as a passive agent in the systematic reproduction of white racial privilege across generations. These scholars find that white students are increasingly overrepresented at the 468 most prestigious and selective four-year colleges and universities. Blacks and Latinas, on the other hand, are, quote, more and more concentrated in the 3,250 underfunded open access 2- and 4-year colleges. And as I discuss more in the book, this is significant because these institutions have much less money to spend on students and on student learning. Catholic colleges and universities replicate the interlocking patterns of race, wealth, and selectivity of the country's most selective universities. The most highly selective Catholic institutions, with a few exceptions, have the least amount of racial diversity among students. In fact, they are less racially diverse than Columbia, Harvard, Stanford, and MIT. Even some of the less selective Catholic schools have overwhelmingly white student bodies. To be certain, some very fine Catholic institutions have diverse student bodies. Yet, minoritized students, particularly Blacks, Latinx, and Indigenous peoples, remain underrepresented at many Catholic institutions. No doubt these schools have attempted to enroll and retain more minoritized students. However, the Catholic call to solidarity requires dismantling the obstacles to enrolling and graduating minority students, especially from the most marginalized groups. Among other things, this requires confronting the historical legacy and ongoing problems of racism and white supremacy on our campuses by taking a hard look at campus cultures, our curricula, the racial composition of our boards, and top administrators. We need to go beyond declarations to actions. We need, for example, to heed the substantial evidence against using standardized tests, given the barrier they create for many minoritized students, as anti-racism scholar Dr. Ibram Kendi and many others have pointed out. I'm happy to say that a number of institutions, Holy Cross, of course, among them, have jettisoned these tests, but yet some institutions like my alma mater, Georgetown University, insist on continuing to use these tests, even in the midst of a pandemic. We will also need to do a better job of hiring and retaining minority faculty members for the sake of justice and to provide more mentorship opportunities for students of color. We cannot continue to overburden faculty and staff of color on our campuses, perpetuating the cultural taxation that can lead to burnout and undue levels of stress and attendant health problems. According to recent U.S. Department of Education IPEDS data, at the 166 Catholic colleges and universities with a tenure system, only 3.38% of all tenure track or tenured faculty were African American. Only 4.37% were Hispanic or Latina. Thus, we must address the so-called pipeline problem. As recently as 2014, only 14% of all doctoral degree recipients were Black, Latina, or Native American. Of those, many chose careers outside the academy. This brings me back to where I started. Catholic institutions must challenge the core structures of the neoliberal corporatized university. They cannot, in good faith, encourage young Black, Latinx, or Native American students to pursue a career in the academy when, first, the majority of jobs available to them are contingent positions, and second, minoritized people are already overrepresented among part-time faculty. It is morally suspect to encourage people of color to take jobs that may well consign them to the growing ranks of the quote, hyper-educated poor, to use Alyssa Court's term. There are some positive examples of institutions that have done a better job recruiting and retaining faculty of color, such as Loyola Marymount, which invested major resources to hire 100 full-time faculty with an eye towards increasing diversity. Nonetheless, Catholic institutions need more efforts to address the systemic barriers to diversity, equity, and inclusion. Those efforts must also include promoting gender equity and LGBTQ inclusion on our campuses. Unfortunately, I have scarce time remaining to discuss these issues. Furthermore, I don't mean to conflate them. Nonetheless, I hope I can offer some initial insights about how CST can promote the dignity, equality, and full participation of women and LGBTQ persons in Catholic higher education. In spite of real gains for women in the academy, gender parity remains far from reach. Like students of color, women students have a disproportionately small pool of women faculty mentors, as the proportion of women full-time faculty members is only 42%. On the other hand, women comprise the majority of the exploited adjunct faculty labor pool. Gender-based injustices do not only affect part-time faculty. The average pay of full-time male professors at four-year private institutions is almost $18,000 more than what full-time women earn. I have found that many Catholic institutions have made strides towards greater pay parity, but that mitigating differences in pay among the disciplines would promote greater pay parity between men and women. Fields that are heavily dominated by males, such as business management, biological sciences, and engineering, pay higher. And we should not let market fundamentalism justify those disparities. In addition, as women ascend each rung of the ladder in the academy, their number wanes. As recently as 2014, women only represented 31% of all full professors. Women also occupy only 27% of all university presidencies. Men outnumber women 2-to-1 on university boards. Given the obstacles women face in the academy, attaining parity in leadership positions among the faculty and administration continues to look like a Sisyphean task, especially for women raising children as they negotiate the rigors of university life. The ratcheting up of demands in the neoliberal corporatized university makes having children a significant liability for a woman's academic career. In their book, Do Babies Matter? Gender and Family in the Ivory Tower, Marianne Mason, Nicholas Wolfinger, and Mark Goulden argued the academy is hostile to workers who have families. In fact, they point out that, quote, the academy is less family friendly for both men and women, end quote, than other demanding professions such as law and medicine. Research has shown that many childless faculty members who would like to have children, according to Mason, Wolfinger, and Golden. This is particularly true of women. Single women without children get tenure track jobs at rates 16% better than childless men after graduate school. However, women with young children, namely under 6 years of age, are, quote, 21% less likely to land a tenure track position, end quote, than a female without a child, and 16% less likely than a comparable father, hence the baby penalty, as they call it. Having children does not appear to create an obstacle for men to getting a tenure track job. Yet, women on the academic job market with young children encounter this baby penalty. These women face, quote, prejudice against mothers and future mothers, end quote. The neoliberal corporatized university will employ women and use their skills as much as men, so long as they are, quote, unencumbered by husbands and young children, end quote. Catholic ethicists Bridget Burke-Revisa and Karen Peterson-Iyer have considered this question. Their conclusions can be summarized as follows, quote, women are not adequately supported in academia, even at Catholic universities, in spite of that tradition's professed commitment to the health and well-being of families, end quote. They contend that Catholic universities are not in the vanguard of family-friendly institutions. Unfortunately, my own research, which entailed looking at the Chronicle of Higher Education's Great Places to Work surveys, confirms their contention. Some Catholic institutions have adopted forward-thinking family-friendly policies. For example, Benedictine University and the College of St. Mary in Omaha, which has provided housing for single mothers since 2000. However, many Catholic institutions must consider how they can make their institutions more family-friendly in order to conform to Catholic teaching on the value of parenthood and family. The point I was trying to make there is that there are Catholic institutions are scarcely represented in the Chronicle of Higher Education's Great Places to Work surveys, which includes information about family-friendly policies. In other ways, Catholic colleges and universities have made progress in the area of gender equity, but still have much more work to do. For example, Dr. Susan Ross, an esteemed theologian at Loyola University of Chicago, celebrates the fact that feminist studies are no longer viewed skeptically, that women's studies programs at Loyola have existed since 1979. However, Ross asks why women's and gender studies at her institution and others remain underfunded and essentially have to borrow faculty from other departments. She also critiques a culture rooted in the patriarchy of religious orders that founded institutions. The continual existence of what she calls old boys networks still prompt questions about who makes the, quote, real decisions and, quote, who holds the real power at these institutions. I suspect many women at Catholic colleges and universities share Ross's sentiment. Dr. Mary Antoinette Smith, a professor of English and Women's and Gender Studies at Seattle University and the former director of the National Association for Women in Catholic Higher Education, maintains that too often Catholic institutions like hers, quote, we're closer to living out the principles of our mission statement 2 decades ago than we are now. She laments that, quote, nowadays we're operating more like a corporation than a Jesuit and Catholic institution. Catholic institutions must strive to eradicate all microaggressions and injustices against women, discussed, for example, by scholars like Anne-Marie Vaccaro and others. For starters, Catholic universities and colleges that do not already have a standing commission on women should institute one, and one that has real power, real teeth. Institutions must also do a better job of fostering parity and real participation of women's leadership at the highest levels. They must eschew tokenism and avoid seeing strong women as leaders as what feminist scholars Sue and Gauguin call double deviants, who have rejected their feminine nature to assume roles stereotypically reserved for males. And of course, Catholic universities must be forthright and steadfast in dealing with the horrifying problem of sexual assault on our campuses. As I discussed in my book, far too often Catholic colleges and universities, like many secular institutions, fail to address this problem adequately for fear of tarnishing their reputations. Some institutions have taken positive steps in this direction, but as James Keenan, SJ, has stated, quote, universities' inability to address the sexual assault issue without federal oversight is a combination of old boy resistance and the university's general disinterest in ethics that together leaves the university incompetent in adjudicating fairly the reports it receives, end quote. One of the hallmarks of Catholic education is care for the whole person, or cura personalis in Ignatian terms. This means attending to the needs of the person in his or her totality. This resembles, in my view, Anne Marie Vaccaro's call to see women and men and persons of all genders in the fullness of their intersectional identities. Sexual orientation and gender identity are constitutive elements of personhood. Care for the whole person should not ignore these facets of one's identity. In the wake of the tragic 2016 Orlando nightclub shooting, Bishop Robert McElroy of San Diego stated, quote, "This tragedy is a call for us as Catholics to combat ever more vigorously the anti-gay prejudice which exists in our Catholic community and in our country," end quote. In accordance with the gospel message in CST on human dignity and the right to participation, Catholic colleges and universities must show love and solidarity towards LGBTQ members of their communities. Although some people perceive higher education as a bastion of liberalism, colleges and universities are not free of homophobia and discrimination against LGBTQ persons. LGBTQ students, faculty, and administrators report harassment, 36% of undergraduates, 29% of all respondents, 92% of all transgender students. They report fear, 20% of all respondents, and the need to hide their identities, 50% of all respondents, to quote, avoid intimidation. Suicide rates among LGBTQ young people cause grave concern, as they're 2 to 3 times that of heterosexuals. Many LGBTQ young people experiencing suicidal thoughts or carrying out suicide attempts have encountered verbal or physical bullying. While many members of the LGBTQ community feel secure in their identities and are welcome in their communities, it is clear that not all of them feel safe on our campuses. Catholic colleges and universities exhibit significant differences on LGBTQ issues. At least one Catholic university, it is reportedly the case that a course that teaches homosexuality as a form of deviance is offered. On the other hand, New Age Ministry, which was founded in 1977 to minister to gay and lesbian Catholics, lists 118 Catholic colleges on its website that are gay friendly, in their words. Although these institutions do not necessarily meet the more robust criteria delineated by Campus Pride, to be listed by New Age Ministry, they must at least have a support group for gay and lesbian students. So what else can be done? For starters, Catholic institutions can and should credibly portray LGBTQ equity and inclusion in the language of Catholic social teaching, thereby showing it's part of their mission. In this vein, the faith lives of LGBTQ students should not be ignored. Programming should be developed that integrates their spiritual identities with their sexual orientation and gender identities, as these students may feel shunned by their religious traditions and experience a spiritual void. LGBTQ studies provides an intellectual space to explore issues related to sexual orientation and gender identity. This exploration can and should entail, quote, religious, philosophical, or ethical perspectives at a Catholic university, as DePaul's administration admirably maintained. In addition, LGBTQ student services offices with full-time staff and LGBTQ student groups are essential to serving the needs of students. These offices and programs must not be siloed, but rather located together with other diversity and multicultural offices, not subsumed within those other offices, but at least located together and seen as on par. Likewise, Catholic colleges and universities must ensure that non-discrimination against LGBTQ persons is embedded in all recruitment, hiring, promotion, and retention policies. In addition to preventing discrimination against individuals, such policies enhance the school communities, as a lack of LGBTQ faculty and staff deprives students of people they can confide in as they discern their own identities and learn to love themselves. Those institutions that have not already done so should follow the lead of others that explicitly inscribe sexual orientation and gender identity into their non-discrimination policies. These policies must include zero tolerance for bullying and harassment. Experts note robust discrimination policies represent one of the most needed protections for LGBTQ members of our communities. As theologian Elizabeth Vasco maintains, quote, gay bashing affirms heteropatriarchy and is a form of what she calls social control that seeks to limit or deny the full participation of LGBTQ persons in the community. CST calls for unambiguous policies that protect their right to participation. Here's my conclusion. Again, I realize I've covered a lot of terrain in a short amount of time. I know I've left a lot of questions unanswered and my thoughts are underdeveloped here. I hope I at least have given us some things to consider tonight at our Catholic colleges and universities. I also hope that we at Catholic colleges and universities attend to each other's needs as human beings rather than treat one another as solely as workers or students who must always produce and therefore put aside our deepest longings and needs far too often. Thank you for listening so patiently.
Thank you, Jerry. I appreciate that. There's an awful lot there. I want to point out, as I was thinking about your presentation, I'm aware of how many of the range of Catholic colleges and universities in the US and in Canada. And we've got a number of them here as I was looking around. If I missed anyone, forgive me, but we got people from Marian, Xavier, Fairfield, Holy Cross, University of Portland, John Carroll, 2 from Canada, St. Paul's and St. Thomas More, Loyola Marymount. You gave a lot of kudos to Loyola Marymount, so Elizabeth will be happy with that. Stonehill, Incarnate Word in Texas, St. Mary's in Texas. So as I look at the range of schools in America, I'm aware that some of those, like my own, that seem to have played along fairly well with the corporatized neoliberal state, have a lot of resources to do all these things you want to do, and that there are some that are really struggling. So there's a kind of where to start. There are so many wonderful things here that I agree with. I'm glad every day I'm not a president or a provost, not that anyone has asked me. So like, where do I begin with all of this? Because there are so many good things to do, and probably the payoff for the LGBTQ programs or the more equal salaries for people who clean the dorms or feed the food can come from places that have more resources to do it, arguably. How do you think about that? Because I think ethics is about those trade-offs that we make.
I hope this doesn't sound smug, but let me start by saying where we shouldn't begin. We shouldn't begin by pitting students against faculty in terms of budgetary trade-offs. Or this happens all the time when I give these talks. I'm so often asked, well, you're calling for higher pay for adjunct faculty, that's going to raise tuition, as if it's automatically a zero-sum game. Well, no, there's a much larger budget that we need to look at, right? This is the point that the economist Schulman makes. I'm happy to be able to quote economists who know a lot more about crunching numbers than I do. Institutional priorities, Schulman says. So we shouldn't start with that conversation that we can't do it all, and if some of the things you're calling for are going to require, it's going to hurt students if we advocate for greater adjunct faculty pay, or it's going to hurt faculty if you want to drive the cost of tuition down and provide more need-based aid. No, not necessarily. There will be some times when painful trade-offs have to be made, but let me now try to answer your question in a somewhat positive direction. I think where we need to start is with transparent dialogue and conversation. I won't say whom I have in mind, but I have it on good authority that a certain Jesuit who belonged to a number of boards of trustees, someone that I know quite well, would often say in these board meetings, show me the books. If you're going to make those claims about our finance issues, show me the books. So that's where I think we should start, with transparency. Then we can have the conversation sincerely and honestly about trade-offs that need to be made. Another place to start is, I think, on the cultural philosophical level. It's remarkable to me that at the institutions where I've worked, and I've heard similar stories from others, sometimes when staff and faculty or students are willing to make sacrifices, they're told they can't. I'll give an example. So we in our faculty congress at my institution passed a resolution stating that those of us like myself who have tenure track privilege would be willing to give up a greater portion of our benefits during the pandemic in order to spare people at the lower rungs of the pay scale, the need to experience these cuts. We were told no. This is mind-boggling to me. We were told no, you cannot practice solidarity. They didn't use those words, of course. So I think what I'm trying to say, Tom, is we have to talk about this level of principle and deeper culture. when I talk about this, how homo economicus and these hyper-individualistic practices have infected our universities. So we need to have those conversations, I think, for quite a long time and deeply before we can actually get to the level of policy. Otherwise, if we rush the level of policy before saying, hey, wait a minute, this is who we are, this is who we believe we are as human beings, these are the obligations we have to one another as human beings and as members of a Catholic Christian institution.
And I don't mean to suggest that those aren't institutions that I can look at and say, hold it, you spent money on this and not this. So I think everyone can do some of that, but I think there was a trade-off that I want to capture. But I don't want to ask all the questions. Who else would like to ring in, or what else would you like to discuss? Aaron/Matt.
Thanks, Tom, and thanks, Gerald, for a really great talk. We're starting to read your book here at Fairfield, and so one other topic that's coming up, as I'm sure is coming up at a lot of our institutions, are conversations around DEI. And so, we have a committee that's working on this in our college. And one thing that never comes up, though, in these conversations is what makes our DEI, committee Catholic and Jesuit. And so, I'm wondering, could you talk a little bit about, kind of from your perspective, are there things we should be considering? What should DEI work look like at a Catholic Jesuit university? In what ways is it similar to work that's going on at our neighboring institutions that are secular? But in what ways is it unique? Thanks.
Sure. I saw a very interesting comment from Alex Mikulich, who does incredible work on anti-racism work. So I'd be curious to hear what you have to say about this, Alex. But I'll give a shot first, Aaron. So I try in my chapter in the book to talk about these issues in the language of Catholic social teaching. So I start with the right to participation as a way, and I start with, I don't know, you may not have read this chapter yet, but I start with an anecdote that really stuck with me all these years. A number of years ago, I heard Father Joseph Brown, an amazing Jesuit, give a talk at my previous institution, St. Joseph's, where he started, those of you who read the book, you'll know this anecdote. He started the talk by singing the spiritual Plenty Good Room. And it was the first time I'd ever heard an academic start a lecture by singing Plenty Good Room. But what occurred to me as I listened to his talk is he was talking about the right to participate in those structures around us that affect our lives deeply. And so I try to ground much of what I say in the chapter on racial justice on and equity on in that language of the right to participation, also human dignity and solidarity. So I think that and I don't know if this is what you had in mind, Alex, but I think we should be talking about the principles of Catholic social teaching and how they relate to these issues. And that's what I try to do in the chapter.
Alex, what did you mean by stop the jargon?
Yeah, I mean, we have this, there's a jargon: diversity, equity, inclusion. Okay. I think that we need to break down, we need to get away from using jargon when we're talking about the issues that Jerry has just described. Is about people's lives, people's livelihoods. This is about not only individuals, but as Jerry was talking about, it's about families. It's also about communities. I think when we use a jargon like that, it can become very easily abstract, and we can get away from the work that has to be done in terms of listening to individual and community experiences of what's going on. So what I'm saying there is pretty simple. It's not, and I'm not, diversity, equity, inclusion sounds really good. But too often, like, and Jerry has talked about this quite a bit, you know, too often we can use that kind of language as a way to really escape responsibilities of actual solidarity.
So, I mean, Matt asked, Alec, well, let me ask you this. I mean, you've given your work towards anti-racist solidarity. So people could turn around and say, stop the jargon of DEI as an excuse to get away from it. And then, but I know that, I presume that's not what you mean by it, so.
No, I mean, I think Jerry's chapter, he gets into depth about what diversity, equity, inclusion means. All I'm saying is that I think we need to be really careful about using terms like that. When people are facing issues of life and death, really, and many of the issues that Jerry's talking about in his book are life and death issues. And I just want to say, step back and let's try to break down the conversation a little more. Yeah, we need diversity, equity, inclusion, of course. But let's get underneath the jargon to really talk about the nuts and bolts and bread and butter issues that Jerry's calling us to talk about.
So there are a few comments in there. Aaron's asking, is there alternative language you would use?
Actually, I think that we need an entirely different way of thinking about the issues at stake, but I don't want to get away from Jerry's book right here. So.
Oh, Kathy is leaving. Kathy had her hand, all right, bye Kathy. I mean, it's clear, one of the things that I have been thinking is that there is a way, the bureaucratization that goes with the corporatized higher education. There are DEI bureaucracies, there are other kinds of bureaucracies that I often wonder to what degree they solve the problem and to what degree they are corporatized ways of addressing them, even though they're well-intentioned, even though they're people I love who worked hard to do those kinds of jobs. I wonder how you really address them otherwise, but
just a quick comment on this. I really appreciate Alex's insights. I continue to learn from him. I've been learning from him for a long time. You know, one of the things I'm saying in the book is, you know, we talk about Catholic social teaching. We often refer to the seamless garment. We talk, you know, I was talking about integral ecology, Pope Francis's term. Why is it that in DEI conversations I never hear the facts on the ground that I talked about, that minoritized faculty are greatly overrepresented among adjunct faculty, which means they're earning poverty wages, which means their lives are at stake, their families. That's what Alex was saying, right? So we have to be really careful because I saw somebody in the chat talked about DEI being co-opted. And I think that's exactly right. Like, let's be careful because, you know, what are we really talking about? We're talking about just checking some boxes and, you know, making sure we meet some numbers, but what do those numbers really mean? And what do they mean for people's lives? Yeah.
You ought to put something in there because you're good at making the points.
Hi, this is Amy. I realize that we are almost out of time, and I don't want the time to go by without my saying how very much Charlene and I have enjoyed this conversation. And I assume it's Jerry and not Gerald. We bought your book while you were speaking. So Yeah, look forward to learning more.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. I wish,
Thank you.
and I know Tom wants to stop at 8, but if there are other questions, I'm happy to take more.
Carla, Elizabeth, I'm sorry, Elizabeth. They switched on my screen.
Sorry, that's okay. I actually haven't read the book yet. I had wanted to, but time got away from me. I think, as you were talking about the issues of DEI and the jargon of DEI and the sort of lived experiences and lived realities that people are confronting, it reminded me of Eve Tuck's and Wayne Yang's article, Decolonization is Not a Metaphor, and how sometimes the metaphorical language that we use around some of these issues actually prevents us. It becomes a sort of empty signifier that prevents us from doing the real work that changes actual experiences. But what I was also thinking of is that, I think you make a lot of very persuasive appeals to Catholic social teaching as a way to address some of these problems. As a historian, I'm also going to perhaps want us to pay maybe a little bit more attention to some of the tensions where Catholics teaching is, and the history of the Catholic Church is also itself a problem, right? And where it sometimes doesn't facilitate a solution, but rather can complicate it. And I'm thinking of particularly in issues around women and the full participation of women in the life of their communities, but also of LGBTQ people. Where I think some of those tensions really come out. And part of that is US culture around these issues as well, admittedly. But I do think those are tensions there where you bang up against things that even when we're trying to create more just universities or more just societies, and we can appeal to Catholicism and Catholic social teaching in certain ways, there are limits to that appeal as well. So that just by way of a couple comments. And
I think
thanks for the talk.
You're absolutely right, Elizabeth. I try to address this to some degree in that last chapter. I'm acutely aware of what you're saying, and I think I don't know that I adequately address it in the book, but I talk about, for example, it may seem fruitless to appeal to Catholic social teaching to talk about the full participation and equity of women when the Catholic tradition itself has and continues, frankly, to marginalize women. I could say a heck of a lot about that because I have a lot of women in my family who have decided to leave the church for that reason. And I understand them. So you're right. What I try to do in the book is to say in those cases where official Catholic social teaching falls short, we want to try to stand on the growing edge of it. Right. So, so I try to do that by appealing to the work of feminist Catholic scholars like Christine Fear-Hinsey and others who have tried to show how the tradition can be stretched and in order to deal with the tension that you rightly point to. It does need to be stretched in a number of ways. And one other thing I want to say, because in the short talk I couldn't get into it, I try to say in the first chapter that the values and principles of Catholic social teaching are not unique to the Catholic tradition. We don't have the Catholic tradition doesn't have a monopoly on these values and principles. Lots of traditions share them. There's lots of substantive overlap. I quote figures like a number of figures like Malcolm X, for example, to say there are other traditions, strands of thought that share these goals that we're striving for. We just happen to work at Catholic institutions. We should value those other traditions and welcome them into our communities. But since we are Catholic institutions, we should be paying attention to this tradition, and we're not very often.
So Jerry, I just want to wrap up formally. I think people can stay on a little bit, but I appreciate that you have shared with us, I think some of the present and forward-looking challenges that we face as Catholic colleges and universities. There are opportunities. I know we're in a world where there is an extraordinary amount of fear, really, among people I talk to at all but the most elite Catholic colleges, and actually fear even at some of the elite ones, to be honest, about where we're going, about what's possible in the future, about how things are going to get reshaped. So I think you give us a clarion call to a sense of direction and focus that we can work with. And that's particularly helpful. So I'm grateful to that and grateful to those who joined us tonight. I will end things formally there, but if anyone wants to stay on and ask an additional question, I'm not going to cut anyone off there. But so anyway, thank you very much.
Thank you, Tom. And thanks to everybody who came. I really appreciate your time. I know that we're all very busy people and under a lot of stress for a number of reasons.
Thanks.